Welcome to Arizona Cardinals Underground.
Pass.
The latest news and notes from the guys who cover the team.
Wait, twist it!
From Cardinals headquarters in Tempe, here's Darren Urban.
We're talking draft here on azcardinals.com, another edition of Cardinals Underground. I'm Darren Urban alongside Kyle Odegard and Dave Pasch, voice of the Arizona Cardinals. And as we look at the draft coming up, there's a lot of names. As we move towards the draft, everybody starts getting more and more familiar with names beyond Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota. But when the Cardinals are picking at 24, Dave, it's much harder to get a handle on anything. And we saw this last year. The Cardinals ended up trading back, taking Washington State safety Deone Bucannon, which quite frankly hardly anybody was paying attention to or noticed. When you're a team picking at 24, what do you, as a fan, how do you start looking at your guys? Because many of these guys that we keep talking about are not going to be around or not going to be the pick. That's the bottom line.
I think you got to have a group of guys that you hope are there.
Yeah.
You have a group of guys that you think likely will be there, and then you have a group of guys that, hey, if all these guys are gone, what's our next step? Is it trading down? Do we reach for a guy here? And I think there are a lot of names out there that mock drafters are putting in there for the Cardinals, and chances are that the guys that people are talking about aren't even on the Cardinals' radar. I think there are a lot of guys that the Cardinals and other teams do a good job of smoke screening so that people have no idea when it's coming. Remember last year, there were some people thought Blake Bortles might slide even to the 20s. He was gone at number 3. They never talked about Bortles. So we can play this game all we want for the next couple of weeks, but come draft night, we'll probably all be surprised.
It reminds me so much of the Mariota talk right now. I mean, everybody keeps talking about how he might slip, and I'm thinking he's not going to slip. He's a quarterback, and he's got a chance to be a good quarterback, and those guys just don't slip. So Kyle, if you're looking at what a lot of people are looking at are pass rushers, and aside from the Cardinals for a moment and whether a guy is going to get all the way back there, and maybe not necessarily whether he's going to get back there. There's so many guys that people are talking about as high picks, but because it's a premium position, do any of those 5 or 6 guys even fall?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's the interesting part is there are a lot of good pass rushers, and you look at if it was a different position, the Cardinals would be feeling good if there's 5 guys that you really like and you're at 24 at one position. But since everybody always wants pass rushers, and that's the Cardinals' biggest need, but every team in the NFL wants more pass rushers. So I think it's a very good possibility that all 5 of those guys could be gone by 24, and that's when you have to start thinking, do we want to move up for a guy, or do we want to look at that 6th or 7th guy that might be early second round projections that we'd be willing to take at 24, or do you say we're going to go to a different position and just realize that those guys are going to be gone?
Dave, you've watched a lot of college football. I don't know how much you've seen of all the premier pass rushers, but if you could pick one guy who you're thinking that guy is going to hit as a pass rusher, and maybe one of these other elite guys who you're thinking, maybe he's getting a little bit too much hype right now.
Well, I think there are 2 guys that I would love to see in a Cardinal uniform in particular. Shane Ray is one of them from Missouri. Shane Ray, who was the player of the year in the SEC and 2 years ago was a backup to the player of the year in the conference. This guy's an elite talent. He, to me, was the best pass rusher in college football last year. Now, chances are Shane Ray's not going to be there at 24. Maybe he slides. Maybe the Cardinals move up. The other guy's Bud Dupree out of Kentucky. He was on a bad defense for the most part last year, yet his numbers were pretty good. What does that tell you? Well, despite the fact that he was the target of opponents' offenses, he still beat double teams. He still made plays. And then he goes to the combine and he has a 42-inch vertical and runs a sub 4.4. The guy's a freak athlete, and he was productive as well. So I think those are 2 guys that you look at and say, hey, these are guys that I think can't miss NFL guys. Randy Gregory's a question because of the character issues.
Yeah.
There's some teams that will take him and put him in a quote box and say, we're not going to pick him no matter what because of some of the character issues. Eric Armstead from Oregon's an intriguing guy because of his athletic ability, but do you look at him and say, we kind of already have a guy like that in Calais Campbell, and we just drafted another guy last year who's very similar to Eric Armstead. Do we need, how many 6'8" guys do we need? But I guess to answer your question, Ray and Dupree are really the 2 guys I think that stand out.
And Keim did such a great job with Tyrann Mathieu and talking to him when he obviously had the marijuana troubles in college and he didn't play for a year. And Tyrann, since being here, we've all gotten to know him. He's such a great guy, and he's stayed out of trouble. And now you look at Gregory and you wonder what Steve thinks of him, but he did a good job of realizing that Tyron loves football and he was wanting to get his life in order. So not that Gregory doesn't have his life in order, but you want to know if he can be a force on the football field and stay out of trouble off it. And that's a big thing to decide because he might slip lower and you have to decide if he's there. Do you want to take a risk on somebody like that?
Well, and Steve has made very clear about anybody that they're drafting. And this is the problem that all these general managers and teams have, which is ultimately they can watch the film and they can see what kind of football player they are, but they can't climb inside the guy's head. They don't know exactly what he's going to be when he becomes a professional off the college campus, when he gets money, how much he actually loves the game. You try and figure out the best you can how much he loves the game, and I know that's a phrase that Steve likes to talk about with trying to weed these guys out. But you can't know for sure. You can't. You can get an idea, but you just don't know for sure. I bounce when we start talking about names, and we've talked about this before, Dave. The running back in the first round probably seems like a little bit of a stretch given how Steve and Keim and the Cardinals like to look at things. We look at the running backs that could be around. This is universally thought of as a deep running back draft. So if you're not talking about the Gurleys and the Gordons of the world, there are guys that people have heard of that could be had in the third and fourth round that might work. And again, third and fourth round. Again, going back to maybe some of the guys you've seen, anybody stick out that might be around there in the mid rounds that could still be an impact guy?
Yeah, I saw most of the guys the last couple of years. Gurley and Gordon both several times, and Amir Abdullah is another guy who probably doesn't get the hype of those other two, but I think has a chance to be just as good. He's a different type of back. There's a kid out of Minnesota named David Cobb who could be a mid to late round pick who had a really good year last year. I think he's an NFL back. And based on just looking at the Cardinals roster, the running back position, I think they believe, and there are like a lot of teams now, that you can find running backs. You can find guys in the mid to late rounds. So if a David Cobb, somebody like that, is there, 4th, 5th, 6th round, I think you take a look at that. But if not, I think the Cardinals are okay at that position, unless you can get Adrian Peterson. I think the Cardinals, that position isn't that bad. I think Bruce Arians feels like, Andre Ellington, if healthy, he's still a guy that we can have as a focal point of the offense. And it's a question mark because of the injuries, but he's got the talent. They saw enough 2 years ago to believe last year and make that statement. So I don't think they're going to just dismiss it and move on.
Yeah, if you didn't have Andre Ellington in the fold, then you start thinking, okay, we need a guy that's going to carry the ball 20 times a game, and then Melvin Gordon or Todd Gurley, I think, make more sense. But the fact that Ellington led the league in yards per carry 2 seasons ago and was never really healthy all last season, and we've seen the explosiveness in him. We've seen his receiving ability, he can carry the ball still, I think optimally maybe 10 to 12 times a game, and you have somebody else do it 10 times a game. So that's when if you get a 4th-round pick that can do that, and you don't need him to be that featured back, then I think it makes a lot more sense than spending a first-rounder on Gurley or Gordon.
Last position I want to touch on here on this edition of Cardinals Underground, cornerback, which is a position that, as Steve likes to say, you can never have too many of. They did lose Antonio Cromartie in free agency. They got a couple other guys whose contracts are going to be up this year. Somebody you want to move in there at some kind of mix with Patrick Peterson. A couple of names that have popped out to me just because of the chatter. And again, we don't know what the chatter means this time of year because people could be lying all over the place. But it seems like all of a sudden Wake Forest Kevin Johnson is all of a sudden getting a lot of chatter and being talked up more than he might have already been. And then, of course, UConn's Byron Jones, who had the huge workout at the Combine and all of a sudden caught everybody's eye, allegedly caught their eye, and jumped on the radar. When you start hearing this stuff, are you believers in this kind of thing? Is it Smokescreen City?
I think Kevin Johnson, I believe that one maybe more than the other. Trey Waynes, if for some reason he's around, that's a guy I think the Cardinals will look at. There's a couple other guys in Marcus Peters and Jalen Collins. There's some character questions. I don't know if those are guys that the Cardinals would take in that spot at 24, given the character issues there. But I agree. I think it is a position of need. You can never have enough of those guys. The Cardinals can find ways. We saw Damon Buchanan play linebacker last year. They can take talent and find ways to use guys. So I don't know that you need to necessarily worry about, we think this guy here is a better player and he's a cornerback, but man, we really need a pass rusher, so we're going to reach here at 24. I don't think the Cardinals will do that.
Yeah, that'll be the interesting thing, and I agree with you. I think if that's their top-ranked guy and they find a cornerback that they identify and they really like, I don't think they would hesitate to go after him. But also, if it's not their top-ranked guy, they're not going to try to just grab this guy and force feed it. So it's interesting when you talk about these guys that are really good in the combine, and a guy like Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie did that a couple years ago, and he turned out really well. So it's always tough to know when they show all these skills from a smaller school, is it going to work out or not? And it's a risk for these guys, but obviously that's why they get paid to do it and to evaluate these guys. And I think cornerback could happen, I think, but they'll just have to trust their board, and if that guy is there, they'll do it. Obviously, I think still pass rush would be something you'd preferably want, all things being equal.
Yeah, and I don't think we should dismiss the offensive line and offensive tackle. And if you find somebody, if DJ Humphreys from Florida is there, or Andrus Peat, who is a local kid, his dad played for the Cardinals, if he's there, if either of those guys is still around at 24, and again, you have them higher on your board than another position than cornerback or pass rusher, I think the Cardinals would make the pick there and then say, okay, well, we've got 2 left tackles in Valdir and DJ Humphreys, let's say. So now do we take one of those guys and move him to right tackle and say, all right, Bobby Massey, you're back to the bench? I don't think the Cardinals are afraid to do those things and take those kind of risks.
Well, I will say this. It is kind of fun following a team that has won and is far back, and to have the philosophy that Steve Keim does, that he's willing to go in whatever direction. It certainly makes draft weekend a lot more exciting because you're never quite sure exactly where it's going to go, right? So for Dave Pasch and Kyle Odegard, I'm Darren Urban. This has been another edition of Cardinals Underground on azcardinals.com.